Dean Martin's voice cracked on the word forever, and 5,000 people heard it. Wait, because what he had just seen in the front row, tucked between a trembling woman and a man gripping the armrest like it might save him, was something no spotlight was ever supposed to reveal. The boy couldn't have been older than 9, maybe 10, dressed in a suit 2 sizes too big, and he wasn't moving the way children move. He was still, too still, and Dean, mid-lyric, felt something cold slide through his chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The band kept playing. The horns hit their cue, but Dean's eyes stayed locked on that front row for half a second longer than they should have, and the people sitting closest to the stage noticed. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? Because what happened next in that room would be passed down through whispered retellings for decades, and yet almost nobody ever got the full story right. The woman beside the boy, his mother Dean would learn later, had her hand pressed flat against the child's back, as if she could hold him upright by sheer will alone. The man on the other side, presumably the father, sat rigid with his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. They weren't watching the show, they were watching their son watch the show, and there was something in their faces that Dean recognized from a place he didn't like to visit. It was the look of people running out of time. He finished the verse, smiled at the crowd, let his hand drift down to adjust his jacket button, a move so casual nobody would have thought twice about it. But the drummer caught it. Vinnie Caruso had been playing behind Dean for 6 years, and he knew that particular gesture meant something. He just didn't know what yet. The Starlight Room at the Meridian Hotel wasn't the biggest venue Dean had ever played, but it was one of the most unforgiving. 1,200 seats, arranged in tight crescents, every table close enough to see the sweat on a performer's lip. If your voice wavered, they heard it. If your timing slipped, they felt it. And tonight, every seat was filled with people who had paid good money to forget about everything waiting outside. Notice how Dean shifted his weight slightly toward stage left as the orchestra swelled into the bridge. It wasn't random. He'd spotted something else now. A man in a gray suit standing near the service entrance, arms crossed, watching the front row with an expression that didn't belong at a nightclub. The man wasn't security. Security wore black. This man wore the kind of gray that wanted to disappear, and he was failing at it badly. The song ended. Applause crashed through the room like a wave, and Dean let it wash over him, while his mind worked through what he'd just seen. A sick child in the front row, parents barely holding themselves together, a stranger watching them from the shadows. None of it added up to anything good, and Dean Martin had learned a long time ago to trust the mathematics of trouble. He leaned into the microphone with that lazy half-smile. "You know," he said, "I had a whole set list planned tonight. Real professional stuff. The boys back there even rehearsed." He gestured toward the band, drawing laughter. "But I'm looking at this beautiful room, and I'm thinking maybe we throw the list away. Maybe we just see where the music takes us." The crowd cheered. They always did when Dean went off script. What they didn't know was that he'd just bought himself time to figure out what was happening in that front row and why it felt like a splinter working its way under his skin. Listen to what happened next, because this is where most people who tell this story get the details wrong. Dean didn't walk to the edge of the stage. He didn't kneel down and speak to the boy directly. That would come later, but not yet. Instead, he did something far more subtle. He called for a song that wasn't supposed to happen until the second act, a slow, quiet ballad called "The Last Gentle Hour," and he asked the lighting crew to bring the house lights up just enough that he could see the audience's faces. The room shifted. Some people sat up straighter. Others leaned back, drinks in hand, ready to be serenaded. But Dean wasn't looking at any of them. He was watching the boy, and the boy was watching him back, with eyes that seemed too old for his face. The first verse floated out over the crowd, soft as smoke. Dean's voice had always been his greatest instrument, not the most powerful, not the most technically perfect, but warm in a way that made people feel like he was singing only to them. Tonight, though, there was something different in it, a weight, a question, and the boy in the front row tilted his head slightly, as if he could hear it too. What Dean didn't know yet was that the boy had been given 3 months to live, a diagnosis delivered in a sterile office 6 weeks earlier. The parents had tried everything: consultants, experimental treatments, prayers to every saint they could name. Nothing worked. And when their son asked for one thing, they moved heaven and earth to make it happen. He wanted to see Dean Martin sing. Wait, because here's the part that changes everything. The man in gray wasn't a doctor or family friend. He was a reporter for the Los Angeles Herald-Tribune, tipped off by a nurse who shouldn't have been talking. He had a photographer waiting outside, planning to turn this dying child's last wish into a front-page headline. Nobody knew he was there, not yet. The song reached its midpoint, and Dean felt the crowd leaning in. This was the part of performing he lived for, that invisible thread connecting his voice to 1,000 hearts at once. But tonight the thread felt different, thinner, more fragile, because one of those hearts was beating on borrowed time, and somehow Dean could sense it even without knowing the specifics. He noticed the mother wipe her eye with the back of her hand, quick, furtive, hoping nobody would see. The father reached over and squeezed her knee once, twice, then let go. And the boy just kept watching with that strange, ancient stillness that made Dean's throat tighten around the lyrics. The second verse was supposed to be about lost love, about chances not taken. But as Dean sang it, looking at that small figure in the oversized suit, the words started to mean something else. They became about time, about how little of it we get, about how we spend so much on things that don't matter, and then realize the only currency that counted was already gone. By the final chorus, something had shifted in the room. The audience could feel it even if they couldn't name it. The applause that followed was different, softer, more hesitant, as if people weren't sure whether clapping was the right response to whatever they'd just witnessed. Dean took a breath, smiled, adjusted his cuffs, and then he did something he almost never did during a performance. He spoke directly to someone in the audience. "Young man in the front row," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes locked onto the boy. "You've got good taste in music. Your folks bring you here tonight." The crowd's attention swiveled. The mother stiffened. The father's face went pale, and the boy, for the first time all evening, smiled. "Yes, sir," the boy said. His voice was thin, reedy, but it carried. "They said I could pick anywhere. I picked here." Remember this moment, because it's the hinge on which the whole night turns. Dean could have nodded, made a joke, moved on to the next song. That's what a professional would do. Keep the show moving. Don't let any single audience member derail the rhythm. But Dean Martin wasn't just a professional. He was something rarer. A man who understood that sometimes the show isn't the point. "Anywhere in the whole city," Dean repeated. "And you picked this joint? Kid, I hate to break it to you, but the food here isn't even that good." Laughter rolled through the crowd, releasing some of the tension that had been building. The boy laughed too, a small sound, almost fragile, but real. His parents exchanged a glance that contained entire conversations. And in the shadows near the service entrance, the man in gray pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket. Dean saw it, the movement, the glint of a pen. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize a reporter's posture, the particular way they held themselves when they thought they had a story. And suddenly, the pieces began clicking together in his mind. The sick child, the desperate parents, the stranger lurking at the edges. Someone had leaked something. Someone was planning to turn this family's private pain into public spectacle. The next 40 minutes would test everything Dean Martin believed about performance, about privacy, about what a man owes to strangers and what strangers owe to each other. But first, he had to make a decision that would happen so fast most people in the room wouldn't even notice it. Look at his right hand. Watch how it moves to his ear, tugging the lobe once. That was a signal, one the stage manager had learned to recognize years ago, and it meant get someone to that service entrance now, and don't let whoever's standing there leave until I say so. The stage manager, a stout man named Bernie who'd seen everything twice, caught the signal and began moving. Dean turned back to the boy. "Tell you what," he said, "since you came all this way, how about you help me pick the next song? You know any of my records?" The boy's eyes widened. "All of them." "All of them? Now that's either very flattering or very concerning." Dean grinned. "All right, maestro. What do you want to hear?" The boy didn't hesitate. "That's Amor, of course, the song everyone knew. The one that had become so identified with Dean Martin that he couldn't walk down a street without someone humming it. He'd sung it 10,000 times, and sometimes he hated it, and sometimes he loved it. And tonight, looking at this small boy who had chosen to spend some of his remaining days in this room, he felt something else entirely, something that didn't have a name. "That's Amore it is," Dean said, and he meant it like a promise. The orchestra shifted into the familiar introduction, and Dean felt the room lift. This was what people came for, the effortless charm, the sense that nothing in the world could go wrong, as long as Dean Martin was singing about moons and pizza pies. But notice what was happening at the edges of the spotlight. Bernie had reached the service entrance. The man in gray was already arguing, his voice a hissing whisper that couldn't quite be heard over the music. And in the front row, the mother had finally allowed herself to cry, not the careful hidden tears from before, but real ones, streaming down her face while her son watched Dean Martin sing the song he'd asked for. The boy knew. Dean could see it in his eyes, in the way he soaked in every note, like someone memorizing something precious. The boy knew exactly what was happening to him, and he'd made peace with it in whatever way a child can make peace with the unthinkable. And that knowledge, that impossible, heartbreaking maturity, hit Dean harder than anything had in years. His voice didn't waver. His timing stayed perfect. But somewhere deep in his chest, something cracked. Wait until you hear what happened during the second chorus. Dean had been watching Bernie's progress out of the corner of his eye, and he saw the exact moment when the man in gray tried to push past toward the exit. Bernie blocked him, not aggressively, just firmly, the way a bouncer handles a drunk who doesn't know he's drunk. The man's notebook fell. Pages scattered across the floor near the service entrance, white rectangles catching the dim light. And then something unexpected happened. The boy turned around. He shouldn't have been able to see it. He was facing the stage, and the service entrance was behind him and to the left. But children notice things adults miss, and this particular child seemed to notice everything. His head swiveled, his two old eyes found the commotion, and he watched for a long moment before turning back to Dean with an expression that made the singer's breath catch. The boy knew about the reporter too. Somehow, he knew. Dean finished the song in a state of controlled chaos, his performer's instincts carrying him through the big finish, while his mind raced through implications. The applause was thunderous. That's Amore always killed. But Dean barely heard it. He was watching the boy whisper something to his mother, watching her face go through a rapid series of emotions, watching the father lean in to hear what his son was saying. By the time the clapping died down, Bernie had quietly escorted the man in gray to a back office. The notebook and its scattered pages had been collected, and the boy in the front row had made a request that his parents were now struggling to process. He wanted to meet Dean Martin. Not after the show. Now, listen closely, because the next few minutes contained a decision that would define how this story ended. Dean had every reason to say no. The show wasn't over. There were 90 minutes of material planned. The crowd had paid good money. Any manager or agent would have told him to finish the set and meet the kid backstage. But Dean had stopped listening to reasonable people long ago. He stepped back from the microphone, spoke briefly with the bandleader, and walked to the edge of the stage. The spotlight followed him, because spotlights always followed Dean Martin. And when he knelt down at the very front of the stage, close enough to touch the boy if he reached out, the entire room fell absolutely silent. "Hey, pal," Dean said, his voice soft but still carrying through the excellent acoustics. "You doing okay?" The boy looked up at him. "I'm tired," he said simply, "but I didn't want to miss this." Something passed between them. In that moment, an understanding that transcended circumstance. Dean saw a child facing something no child should face, doing it with more grace than most adults could manage. And the boy saw a man who was taking him seriously. "You know what I think," Dean said. "I think this whole show from the stage thing is overrated. What do you say we shake things up a little?" The boy blinked. "What do you mean?" Dean stood up and offered his hand. "I mean, how would you like to come up here with me?" The gasp from the audience was audible. The mother's hand flew to her mouth. The father half rose from his seat, uncertain whether to intervene. And the boy who had been so still all night, who had watched everything with those ancient eyes, grabbed Dean's hand without a moment's hesitation. What followed was unlike anything that crowd had ever seen, or would ever see again. Dean helped the boy onto the stage, settled him into a chair that someone had hastily brought from the wings, and proceeded to perform the next 3 songs directly to him, not facing the audience, facing the boy, as if the 5,000 other people in the room had simply ceased to exist. Remember what this looked like from the audience's perspective. They could see Dean's back, his shoulders, the way his hands moved when he sang. They could see the boy's face, lit by the reflected glow of the stage lights, transformed from that terrible stillness into something alive and shining. They could see something private and sacred happening in public, and most of them had the grace to simply watch in silence. The mother wept openly now. The father had one arm around her, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. And somewhere in a back office, a reporter sat surrounded by his scattered notes, slowly beginning to understand that even if he wrote this story, no one would believe him. Notice the way Dean adjusted his performance. He lowered the key on one song because he could see the boy straining to keep his eyes open. He added little asides, private jokes that made the boy laugh, small sounds that the microphone didn't quite catch, but that rippled through the front rows anyway. He treated this dying child, not with pity, not with the careful distance people usually keep from tragedy, but with the same casual warmth he'd show to an old friend. At one point, between songs, the boy tugged on Dean's sleeve. "Mr. Martin?" "Just Dean, pal. Mr. Martin sounds like my accountant." A small smile. "Dean, are you really singing these songs for me?" Dean knelt down, so they were eye to eye. "Let me tell you something, kid. In my whole career, I've sung for presidents and mobsters and movie stars. I've sung in places so fancy they wouldn't let regular people through the door. But right now, tonight, this is the most important audience I've ever had." He straightened up, adjusted his jacket. "So yeah, these songs are for you." The boy nodded slowly, processing this. Then he asked the question that would stay with Dean Martin for the rest of his life. "Will you remember me?" Wait. Because here's where the story turns and becomes something larger than one night in one nightclub. Dean looked at this child, this stranger's child, this small person he'd known for less than an hour, and he felt the weight of the question in a way that surprised him. Would he remember? Of course he would. How could anyone forget something like this? But the boy wasn't asking about Dean's memory. He was asking about something else, about legacy, about what remains when we're gone. about whether the things we do and the people we touch carry forward into a future we'll never see. Kid, Dean said, I'm going to remember you for the rest of my life. And every time I sing, that's a more. I'm going to think about the night a young man in an oversized suit taught me what these songs are for. The boy considered this. That seems like a long time. It is. And you know what? It still won't be long enough. The show continued, but something had fundamentally shifted. The audience was no longer watching a performance. They were witnessing a moment. And when Dean finally helped the boy back to his seat, back to his parents' trembling arms, the standing ovation that followed wasn't for the songs. It was for something rarer, something that couldn't be rehearsed or choreographed or repeated. The rest of the night passed in a blur of music and memory. Dean finished his set, took his bows, disappeared backstage, to the usual chaos of post-show logistics. But he didn't go to his dressing room. Instead, he found Bernie and asked a single question. Where's the family? They were in the green room, the mother and father, looking shell-shocked. The boy curled up on a couch, with his eyes finally closed. Dean stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching. The father noticed him first, and started to stammer out, thanks. But Dean waved him off. Don't, he said quietly. There's nothing to thank me for. He crossed the room and sat down in a chair across from the sleeping boy. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The mother's tears had dried, leaving tracks of mascara on her cheeks. The father kept opening and closing his hands, like he didn't know what to do with them. And Dean just sat there, looking at the child who had somehow reached through all his defenses and touched something real. The reporter's gone, Dean said finally. I had my people make it clear that if any story appears anywhere, I'll personally ensure he never works in this town again. He paused. That won't hold forever. Someone will talk eventually. But for now, you've got your privacy. The father's voice was hoarse. How did you know about the reporter? About any of it? I've been in this business a long time. You learn to read a room. Dean leaned forward. But I want you to understand something. What I did tonight, I didn't do it for a story, or for publicity, or to look like a good guy. I did it because your son asked to see me sing. And that's, he stopped, searched for the right words. That's the best reason anyone's ever given me to do what I do. The boy stirred on the couch, and everyone fell silent. He didn't wake fully, just shifted position, murmured something unintelligible, and settled back into sleep. In repose, he looked younger than he had all night, more fragile, more like what he was, a child who should have had decades ahead of him. Listen to what the mother said next, because it's the part of this story that Dean would repeat for years afterward. Whenever someone asked him about the most meaningful performance of his career, she looked at her sleeping son, then at Dean, and she said, he stopped being afraid after tonight. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like he was carrying something, and now he's not. Dean nodded slowly. He understood. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the reminder that they matter, that their presence in the world has weight and meaning, that someone sees them. The boy had been seen tonight, truly seen, by 5,000 people, and by one singer who had chosen, for a few hours, to make him the center of everything. The family left through a back entrance, avoiding photographers and fans who lingered. Dean watched them go, father carrying the sleeping boy, mother walking close, and stood in the doorway until their car disappeared. 3 weeks later, Dean received a letter. It was written in a child's careful handwriting, each letter formed with obvious effort. Dear Dean, it began. Thank you for the songs. I listen to the record every night before I sleep. Mom says I smile when That's Amore comes on. I wanted you to know that I'm not scared anymore. You made me feel like I was the most important person in the room. And if I was important enough for Dean Martin to sing to, then I'm important enough to be remembered. I won't forget you either. Your friend, Michael. Dean kept that letter in his wallet for the rest of his life. The boy, Michael, lived for 4 more months, longer than the doctors had predicted, though not long enough, not nearly long enough. He spent those months surrounded by music and family and the particular kind of peace that comes from knowing you mattered. His parents told Dean later that he asked to hear "That's a more" every single day, and that every single time he smiled. And Dean Martin, true to his word, never sang that song again without thinking of the night a brave kid in an oversized suit showed him what music was really for, not for fame, not for money, not for the roar of applause from anonymous crowds, but for moments like that one, singular, unrepeatable, human. Look back at this story and notice how small the turning points were. A cracked voice on the word forever, a stillness in the front row, a hand signal to a stage manager, a reporter blocked at a service entrance, a child's simple request, "Will you remember me?" Each moment tiny in itself, but together they created something that would ripple outward for years, touching everyone who heard the story, changing the way they thought about performance and connection, and the strange brief miracle of being alive in the same room as another human being. Because that's what it always comes back to, in the end. Not the spotlight, not the applause, not the records sold, or the sold-out shows, or the headlines in the morning papers. Just two people seeing each other clearly, even if only for a moment. Just the radical act of being present with someone else's joy and sorrow and fear and hope. Dean Martin sang for another 30 years after that night. He made movies and television appearances and played Vegas more times than anyone could count. But ask anyone who knew him well, and they'll tell you something changed after that night at the Starlight Room. A softness entered his performances that hadn't been there before. A willingness to pause, to connect, to remember that every audience was made up of individual people with individual stories, each one carrying something the spotlight couldn't see. And sometimes, late at night after the crowds had gone home, Dean would sit alone with a glass of something amber and a record playing softly, and he would think about a boy named Michael who had taught him, in the space of one evening, more about music than all his years in the business combined. The spotlight finds who it wants. The audience cheers for what they came to see. But the moments that matter, the ones that last, happen in the spaces between performances, in the choices we make when no one's watching, in the way we answer when someone asks, "Will you remember me?" And Dean Martin remembered. Now, so will you.